From Portraits to Puddles, New York City Memorials from the Civil War to the World Trade Center Memorial by Diane Durante. This was originally given as a walking tour in Battery Park in 2003. I published it as an Amazon Kindle book in 2012, and this YouTube video is from 2018. Introduction. I find Reflecting Absence, the memorial on the site of the World Trade Center, profoundly unsatisfying. If you do too, this essay will help you understand why landscape architecture and a list of names don't make for a memorable memorial. Today, most of us remember vividly the events of 9/11, and we are deeply moved when we stand at the site of the terrorist attacks. But 100 years from now, no one alive will remember the smiles of loved ones setting out to work on that bright September day in 2001. No one standing at the site will remember what he or she was doing when the towers fell and the world changed. What will Reflecting Absence say then? What will the pools, trees, and lists of names tell our great-grandchildren about how we want to remember the people who died that day? Surely we can offer the victims of 9/11 a better tribute than a gloomy park that lingers like a scar in the business district of one of the world's great cities. But what makes an effective tribute? What makes a memorable memorial? One easy way to grasp the possibilities is to look at what previous generations have erected as memorials. The many sculptures in nearby Battery Park provide some excellent examples of memorials created over the past 100 years. In this essay, I'll point out the lessons we can learn from half a dozen of them that can be applied to a memorial for the World Trade Center, and I'll explain how our memorials declined from portraits to puddles. This essay is based on a walking tour that I gave in 2003 when the competition was being held for the World Trade Center Memorial of sculptures in Battery Park and the southern end of Manhattan. Since 2012, it's been available as a Kindle book, From Portraits to Puddles. This essay will be spread out over a series of blog posts and videos. If you click Portraits to Puddles in the Obsessions cloud on the blog post, you'll see all of them. When all the parts have appeared, it will also appear as a video on YouTube. Next section, John Erickson. Our first stop is a portrait sculpture of John Erickson. It's toward the east side of Battery Park near the Starbucks on State Street. Since the sculpture is 10 feet tall and stands on an 11-foot pedestal, you shouldn't have any problem spotting it. The Parks Department has provided a historical marker that tells you all about Erickson. Resist reading it for a moment. It's better to look at a sculpture without preconceptions. Subhead, the Erickson sculpture. Looking at Erickson from the west, what we notice first is his posture. Spine upright, shoulders back. Moving around to the front, we can see from his expression that he's serious, even frowning slightly. The strange object in his left hand suggests that he deals with something mechanical. The device peeking out of his breast pocket, maybe a compass, also suggests something mechanical, mathematical, scientific. The roll of papers in his right hand suggests that whatever it is that he works on, it's complex enough to require a lot of blueprints or specifications. It may be news to you that you can look at details of a sculpture and make such deductions about the subject. In fact, this is the nature of art in general and portrait sculptures in particular. Because this work was created by an artist from scratch, we can assume that every detail is there for a reason, to tell us something about Erickson. If he's standing straight and tall rather than hunched from decades of leaning over drafting tables, that's significant. If he's holding a model rather than an umbrella, and his pocket holds a compass rather than a handkerchief, that's significant as well. Together, the details of this portrait sculpture tell us that Erickson was confident, that he worked in some kind of mechanical field, and that he takes his work seriously. In my book, Getting More Enjoyment from Art You Love, I discuss at much greater length how to observe the details of a sculpture and figure out their significance. Let's get back to that strange object Erickson is holding. It's a model of the invention that he's most famous for, the Ironclad warship Monitor. The Battle of the Monitor and the Merrimack in March 1862 was a crucial event in the Civil War. I want to set the context for that battle by giving you some background on naval warfare and Erickson's career as an engineer. Next section, naval propulsion and naval warfare. Recall what you know of the early 1800s. How were warships propelled? Think of Horatio Hornblower. If you're better on history than on TV and movies, which would make you quite rare and admirable these days, think about the Battle of Trafalgar in the Napoleonic Wars, of which I'm giving you a painting. Ships at that time were propelled by sails, big, billowing sails that had to be hauled up and down by hand and that would move the ship only if the wind blew. And how did such ships attack the enemy? They shot cannonballs, giant lumps of metal from rows of guns along the side of the ship. In the early 1800s came a major technological advance, the use of a steam engine to move a paddle wheel that drove the ship. This was the biggest advance in propulsion since the 15th century, when the Portuguese added a movable triangular sail to square-rigged ships and thereby made the age of exploration possible. The advantages of a steam engine will be obvious if you've ever spent a windless afternoon bobbing up and down on a sailboat, or if you've tried to sail in one direction while the wind resolutely blew from the opposite quarter. Steam power meant ships were much faster and much more maneuverable. The next major development in naval warfare was artillery shells. A shell isn't solid metal or stone like a cannonball. It has an explosive charge inside. Shells had devastating effects on wooden-hulled ships, and especially on those paddle wheels, which made giant, easy targets. Now we come to Erickson. By the 1830s, Erickson had conceived a screw-propelled vessel. The propellers were beneath the waterline like those of a modern motorboat. The United States Navy learned of Erickson's idea and hired him to design a screw-propelled warship. So Erickson came to New York, where he spent the rest of his life and became a familiar sight. Erickson arrived in New York in 1839. 5 years earlier, the Great Fire of 1835 had destroyed 600 buildings in Lower Manhattan. One of them was the Merchants Exchange, with its brand new 15-foot-tall marble sculpture of Alexander Hamilton. In 1840, while the screw-propelled warship was in the works, Erickson won a competition for a steam-driven fire engine that threw water much further than firemen with buckets could. He helped solve a problem that had terrified New Yorkers. If you face the Erickson sculpture and walk around the pedestal to your left, the relief there will show you Erickson's steam-powered fire engine. Next section, screw-propelled warships. The relief on the front of the pedestal shows Erickson's screw-propelled warship, the USS Princeton. The Princeton was a hybrid vehicle. It had sails, quite a lot of them, as well as a steam funnel in the center. The sails were probably a backup system in case something went wrong with that newfangled engine and propeller. When it was launched in 1843, the Princeton was the most formidable warship in the world. She had a 12-inch gun that could launch a 225-pound projectile 5 miles. Imagine the damage that could do to a wooden-hulled ship at close range. Unfortunately, Erickson's colleague, Captain Robert F. Stockton, also designed a gun for the Princeton, and he designed it badly. During the Princeton's trials, Stockton's gun exploded, killing the Secretary of the Navy, the Secretary of State, and the the father of President Tyler's fiancée. Stockton managed to shift the blame to Erickson and arranged that Erickson not be paid for his work on the Princeton. Through the 1850s, Erickson lived in New York, worked as an engineer, pursued his own research on naval warfare, and kept his distance from the U.S. government. By 1861, when the Civil War began, screw-propelled vessels like Erickson's Princeton were still state-of-the-art in naval warfare, but the artillery shells then in use could wreak havoc on such wooden-hulled vessels. Next section, the Ironclads. So now we shift our attention from New York to Virginia. As part of a strategy devised by General Winfield Scott, the Union was blockading the Confederacy's ports, cutting Southerners off from trade and from outside assistance. The largest harbor in the South was Hampton Roads, Virginia. In this contemporary cartoon, Hampton Roads is near the tail of the snake. When the South seceded in late 1860, several U.S. Navy ships were trapped in Hampton Roads. Union sailors burned and sank them to prevent their falling into Confederate hands. One of those ships was the screw-propelled Merrimac. The Confederates raised the Merrimac and covered her with iron plates. Salt water had severely damaged her engines. She sailed lopsided. Nevertheless, she was the most powerful warship afloat because she could withstand artillery shells while bombarding her opponents. She was renamed the CSS Virginia, but since the Union won the war and wrote most of the histories, she's still often referred to as the Merrimac. As soon as the news of the Confederacy's plans for the Merrimac leaked out, the United States Navy urgently requested proposals for an ironclad ship. Erickson submitted a design for a radically new type of ship. If you move around so you're facing Erickson, you can see that he's holding a model of it. It had the iron plates that the Navy required, but its other features were Erickson's inspiration, based on years of experience as a naval engineer. The ship was small, with a crew of only 58. Some warships of the time had crews of 500. Because of its steam engines and small size, the Monitor was very maneuverable. While it had only 2 guns, those 2 were very powerful, and they were set in a rotating turret. What made that idea so brilliant? A rotating turret meant the ship could fire in almost any direction. It didn't have to maneuver so that it was broadside to the enemy. The Navy accepted Erickson's proposal for an ironclad. Erickson himself supervised the construction of the prototype, coordinating work between 3 shipyards in Manhattan and Brooklyn in the dead of winter in 100 days flat, at a time when there were no bridges connecting Manhattan and Brooklyn. And he saw the ironclad successfully launched in front of a horde of skeptical New Yorkers who were certain that an iron ship would sail directly to the bottom of the East River. On the right in this picture is the Continental Iron Works, which are right by Bushwick Creek. If you're familiar with the north side of Brooklyn, it used to be right there where there are now high-rises. In early March 1862, as the Monitor was wallowing her way southward through heavy seas, the telegraph flashed the news to New York and Washington that the Merrimac, on her maiden run out of Norfolk, had rammed and sunk a 50-gun Union frigate, set another on fire, and run a third aground. In a single day's battle, the Confederacy suddenly had the chance to break the Union blockade and become an international sea power. Reports of this foray caused panic in northern coastal cities. George Templeton Strong, a prominent New Yorker, wrote in his diary on February 27, 1862, quote, "Sunday came the disastrous tidings that the Merrimac was on the rampage among our frigates in Hampton Roads, smiting them down like a mailed robber baron among naked peasants. General dismay. What next? Why should not this invulnerable marine demon breach the walls of Fortress Monroe, raise the blockade, and destroy New York and Boston. And are we yet quite sure she cannot? End of quote. Terrified New Yorkers instructed their Common Council to appropriate the enormous sum of $500,000 for harbor defenses, quote, at any sacrifice and at every hazard, end quote. Next section, the Battle of the Ironclads. When the Merrimac returned the next day to finish her work, her crew saw what an eyewitness described as, quote, an immense shingle floating on the water with a gigantic cheese box rising from its center. No sails, no wheels, no smokestack, no guns, end quote. The Monitor had arrived at Hampton Roads. The Battle of the Ironclads on March 9, 1862, is one of the most familiar stories of the Civil War. It ended after more than 4 hours when the Merrimac ran out of ammunition and lumbered away. Although both ships were largely unscathed, in the long term the battle was a Union victory. The blockade remained intact, and the Merrimac was bottled up at Hampton Roads. Although Erickson's Monitor went down in a storm off Cape Hatteras later in 1862, her effect on naval warfare was profound. The British Navy, the most formidable in the world, canceled all outstanding orders for wooden sailing ships. Iron plating, rotating turrets, steam power, and screw propellers were to be the characteristics of the warship of the future. The United States alone built 66 Monitor-type vessels. The last remained in service until 1925. New Yorkers' gratitude toward Erickson for saving their city is expressed in the inscription on the back of the pedestal, which describes him as, quote, a citizen whose genius has contributed to the greatness of the Republic and the progress of the world, end quote. If you haven't read the Parks Department plaque on Erickson, you can read it now online. If you go to the blog post, it'll give you the URL. Also take some time to look at the Erickson sculpture on your own. I haven't discussed every detail of the figure in the pedestal. Try focusing on one detail or one aspect, such as Erickson's face or the textures that are used to represent hair, skin, and cloth. How does that particular detail or aspect help convey Erickson's character? You may be surprised at how much you can observe once you stop, look, and think. Last section for this part. Lesson number 1. This tour is a chronological survey, and we've now covered our Civil War memorial. Let me draw a lesson from it that will later apply to the World Trade Center Memorial. This sculpture shows a man whose efforts helped win the Civil War. He holds a prop, a model of the Monitor, to help remind viewers of what his most important invention was. The reliefs on the base further explain his achievements. So here's our first lesson. The point of this sculpture isn't to teach. If you want to know Erickson's biography, the words on the Parks Department's plaque are far more effective than the sculpture. In a way that words on a plaque cannot do, however, this sculpture reduces Erickson's achievements to essentials so that you can quickly understand and vividly remember what sort of man Erickson was. It's a memorial. That's what memorials do. They help us remember. Your emotional response to this memorial comes from what you know about the man represented. If I told you that instead of a naval engineer, Erickson was a slave-owning plantation owner, your reaction to the sculpture would immediately change. Emotional reactions come from what you see and what you know. More about that in the next section of this essay. For the moment, remember that memorials are to help you remember, and that your emotional reaction comes from what you know about what you remember. This is part 2 of From Portraits to Puddles. It covers the Dewey Memorial. To get to the Dewey Memorial, turn your back on Erickson and walk toward Castle Clinton, that round, one-story stone building a couple hundred feet away. keep Castle Clinton on your right as you head toward the water. The Dewey Memorial stands on the left, just before the steps that lead down to the promenade along the water and the gangway for the Statue of Liberty Ferry. The memorial is a bronze plaque about 3 feet high on a slanted granite support. It's so small that it's often obscured by pushcart vendors. We're pausing to look at it because the medallions reproduced on it were designed by Daniel Chester French. French is best known for the seated Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial. He also sculpted the 4 continents that stand in front of the nearby U.S. Customs House at Bowling Green. Next section, the Dewey Medal. French was one of America's 2 or 3 most distinguished sculptors, so any sculpture of his that you can find is worth a look. The medallions on the Dewey Memorial are reproduced from a medal that Congress awarded to all members of the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps who were present at the Battle of Manila Bay on May 1, 1898. This was during the Spanish-American War, which one contemporary dubbed a splendid little war. For more on that, see the essays in Outdoor Monuments of Manhattan on José Martí and Carl Schurz, and particularly the essay on the main monument, a splendid allegorical ensemble at Columbus Circle. That's the picture on the right on this slide. The 1,800 or so copies of the medal awarded to those at the Battle of Manila Bay were cast by Tiffany and Company. Each bears on its reverse the name of one of the 7 ships involved in the battle. On this one, it's the USS Concord. On the rim is the name of the serviceman who received it. If you zoom in on this image, you can just see some lettering on the rim below the sailor. French produced a very good likeness of Admiral George Dewey. That's a difficult task in shallow relief where the bone structure can only be hinted at, and one can't use color to help suggest three-dimensionality. The relief on the right of the Dewey Monument, the medal's reverse, shows a sailor perched on a cannon. French succeeded admirably at showing the seated sailor from the front with his legs in proper perspective. Beyond that, French has filled the circular shape of both medallions in a satisfying way, without lopping off limbs or leaving awkward blank spaces. It's a highly competent job. Next section, the Dewey Arch. The Dewey Memorial, honoring the Battle of Manila Bay, the one at Battery Park, is a small, faint reminder of a form of civic celebration that used to be more common than ticker-tape parades. Dewey's return from the Philippines was celebrated in New York by the construction of a triumphal arch in Madison Square. The arch was temporary, built of plaster and wood like the buildings at the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. You may have read about such ephemeral buildings in Eric Larson's best-selling The Devil in the White City. The Dewey Arch was similar to the Washington Arch at Washington Square Park, but the Dewey Arch was much larger. The Washington Arch is 77 by 62 feet. The Dewey Arch was 100 by 80 feet, so about 20 feet higher and 20 feet wider. Like the Washington Arch, the Dewey Arch had numerous allegorical figures representing abstractions, in this case, triumph, victory, and battle. Like the Washington Arch, the sculptures were designed and executed by prominent artists of the day. New Yorkers hoped to raise funds to replicate the arch in a more permanent material. They abandoned their fundraising efforts, however, after Dewey lost the 1900 presidential nomination to William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt. The temporary arch, which by that time had deteriorated into a public hazard, was carted off to the city dump. The Dewey Memorial, as you see it now, with reproductions of French's medallions, was erected in 1973 in honor of the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Manila Bay. Lesson number 2. What does the Dewey Arch show us that's relevant for the World Trade Center Memorial. It wasn't a portrait sculpture. It was architecture, but it was covered with allegorical figures that illustrated how most Americans at the time felt about their victory in the Spanish-American War. The point for the World Trade Center Memorial is that a memorial need not be a representation of a specific person or event. Allegorical or symbolic figures can be very expressive. That's the end of part 2. This is the third in my series From Portraits to Puddles, New York City Memorials, from the Civil War to the World Trade Center Memorial. A bit of background. We've seen memorials from the Civil War in the 1860s and the Spanish-American War, the Dewey Arch. Nearly all the memorials erected in New York for those wars honored specific leaders, although St. Gaudens's magnificent Sherman is a combination of a portrait with an allegorical figure. A few sculptures, such as John Quincy Adams Ward's 7th Regiment Memorial in Central Park and the Civil War Soldiers Monument in the Greenwood Cemetery, represent soldiers who are low-ranking but nevertheless proud and dignified. The next conflict in which Americans fought was World War I. The Great War lasted from 1914 to 1918. Some 20 million people worldwide were killed in combat or died of disease. American troops fought from 1917 to 1918. Of the 4 million Americans sent to fight, 116,000 died. It was a horrendously traumatic conflict. Manhattan has 6 memorials to those who died in World War I. These 2, on the left, are by Philip Martini, who 15 years earlier had sculpted the allegorical groups that stand in front of Surrogate's Court on Chambers Street, New York in infancy and New York during Revolutionary times. If you think something radical is happening in the art world of the early 20th century, to go from these 2 to that one, you are correct, but that's a theory, a story for another time. 2 more memorials to World War I show groups of soldiers that include wounded men. And the last 2 honor a priest and a poet. Flanders Field by Canadian John McCrae was the most famous poem written about the war and one of the most moving. The last few verses are inscribed on the sculpture's pedestal. This is the complete poem. In Flanders fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. The second sculpture on this slide is Father Duffy, a Catholic priest who was chaplain to the Fighting 69th, a regiment that lost all but 600 of its 3,500 members in barely a year. None of Manhattan's 6 memorials to the First World War stands in Battery Park, but Battery Park does have the Coast Guard Memorial, which has the same spirit as many World War I memorials. In this memorial, 3 over life-size figures stand on a pedestal 4 or 5 feet high. The center figure's head is drooping, and his arms are draped over his comrade's shoulders. Clearly he's been wounded. This sculpture has been in storage since at least 2012 due to subway construction through the park, but someday it will come back. Meanwhile, lesson number 3. I noted when talking about Erickson that the point of a memorial isn't to teach us about a person's life or a historical event, but to remind us of what we know to call to mind an admirable person whose life is worth remembering and celebrating. The Coast Guard Memorial doesn't teach us about the Coast Guard. It reminds us of a certain type of person who presumably thrives in the Coast Guard. His work is dangerous, but he does it anyway. And if he's wounded or exhausted, he has brave comrades who will help him survive. This is the fourth in my series From Portraits to Puddles, New York City Memorials from the Civil War to the World Trade Center Memorial. We are looking next at the East Coast Memorial. To reach it, if you're at the Dewey Memorial, walk east away from Castle Clinton on the sidewalk along the water that is officially known as the Admiral George Dewey Promenade. When you reach Gangway 3, you'll see 4 pairs of enormous granite slabs on your left. Towering behind the slabs to the north is an 18-foot-tall bronze eagle on a 6-foot pedestal. The East Coast Memorial honors over 4,600 servicemen who died in the Atlantic during World War II. On the 8 slabs are the name, rank, branch of the armed service, and home state of every single one. The eagle is sweeping down to place a wreath on a wave. The wave, of course, symbolizes the sea. A wreath can symbolize victory, honor, or mourning. Here, it's all 3. The eagle, of course, represents the United States. So this bronze shows the United States honoring and mourning Americans who were lost at sea. All these symbols are pretty common. They're not obscure. They're not difficult to interpret. Normally, animals are less expressive than human figures, but this bronze eagle fairly shouts a message. Its wings, beak, and talons all slant in the same direction. Its feathers are reduced to a few stylized lines that also emphasize the speed of its dive. And look at its eyes, especially from the front. I don't actually know if eagles express emotion with their eyes, but this one has scowling brows that give it a very human ferocity. This eagle's ferocity and single-minded motion imply that although those who erected the monument are mourning, they're not wallowing in despair. They're proud that they fought and won, and they're still willing to fight. We get all that without words from the figure of this eagle. As I said when discussing Erickson, an artist's choice of which details to include and how to show them always conveys a message. That's true even if the subject isn't human. For example, in front of the nearby customs house, there's a fluffy eagle snuggling up to the figure of America and nibbling at the corn in her lap. If that eagle were on the East Coast Memorial, the United States would be shown symbolically as tame and timid. In contrast, the East Coast Memorial's eagle is fierce and intent. The site of the East Coast Memorial even suggests what the soldiers of the Second World War fought and sometimes died for. If you turn your back on the eagle and face the harbor, you'll see the Statue of Liberty centered between the pairs of slabs. This is not accidental. We have rules and regulations and public hearings in New York City that are guaranteed to prevent such things happening by mere serendipity. All right. Lesson number 4 for the World Trade Center Memorial. Go back to the promenade and look at the East Coast Memorial as a whole. Now imagine for a moment that the eagle is gone, which I've done through the magic of Photoshop, and only the long lists of the deceased remain. Who would stop here to read them? Only relatives who were searching for the names of loved ones. It's the addition of a recognizable figure, even if it's a bird rather than a human, that makes this memorial appeal to a much wider audience. I'll come back to this point. In fact, I'll jump up and down on it with both feet in a few minutes. This is part 5 in my series From Portraits to Puddles, New York City Memorials from the Civil War to the World Trade Center Memorial. We are moving on now to the Korean War Memorial. To get there from the East Coast Memorial, retrace your steps northwest along the Dewey Promenade. After you've passed Castle Clinton, bear right away from the water. The Korean War Memorial will be on your left, a 15-foot-tall silhouette of a soldier on a 5-foot-tall pedestal. The paved approach to it is on the north side. This memorial honors those who fought in the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. A Parks Department sign to the left of the approach recounts the major events of the Korean War, which was also known as the Forgotten War. Don't read the sign right now. One way or another, it will affect how you look at this sculpture, and as I said when we looked at Erickson, it's better to approach a sculpture without preconceptions. The sculpture is a trapezoid of polished gray granite. Cut through the granite is a silhouette of a soldier outlined in stainless steel. He wears a helmet, fatigues, and boots, and carries a backpack and a rifle. His head is turned so we can't see the bone structure of his face. The army gear obscures the shape of his body. As a result, this soldier is completely anonymous, even more so than the figures in many World War I memorials who were low-ranking but whose faces we could at least see. What is the significance, what's the purpose of this utter anonymity? To find out, let's look at the memorial's subsidiary details. On the north side, facing the paved approach, is the inscription Korean War 1950-1953. Flanking it are mosaic flags of the United States and South Korea. Below that, 20 smaller mosaic flags encircle the pedestal. Carved into the pavement around the pedestal are the names of 22 countries, each with numbers of dead, wounded, and missing in action. The clue to this multitude of nationalities is the symbol that appears above the Korean War inscription. It's the emblem of the United Nations. The opposite side of the sculpture, the one facing south, bears the inscription, "The Universal Soldier." Unlike other memorials that we've looked at, this one doesn't only honor American soldiers. It honors soldiers of all nationalities who participated in the UN mission to Korea, from Americans and South Koreans to Danish, Canadians, and Thai. Aside from the inscriptions, there's an even less visual message embodied in the Korean War Memorial. According to the sculptor's website, at 10 a.m. on July the 27th, the sun slants through the soldier's empty head and falls in the shape of a small flame on the segment for Greece. This is to commemorate the signing of the armistice that ended the Korean War on July 27, 1953. But unless you happen to know the date and time of the armistice, and you also happen to be visiting the memorial at that moment, you couldn't possibly get that. I've been visiting outdoor sculpture in New York for almost 2 decades and haven't yet managed to be there at the right time, nor have I ever seen a photograph of that effect. Lesson number 5 for the World Trade Center Memorial. It's not wrong to honor every nationality, but the way that it's done here creates a problem. Getting the message, in this case, means reading the flags and the pavement rather than looking at the soldier's figure. This memorial is verbal as much as visual. And because the focus is on nations and statistics, it's difficult to get emotionally involved. It's like reading a list of quotes from the New York Stock Exchange. There is a lot there to rouse passions, but you have to bring a lot of knowledge to the party before you feel any strong emotions. So the lesson for the World Trade Center Memorial is, in visual art, visuals rule. This is the 6th in my series From Portraits to Puddles, New York City Memorials, from the Civil War to the World Trade Center Memorial. We're going to look at just one more sculpture in Battery Park, the American Merchant Mariners Memorial. It's just west of the Korean War Memorial on a breakwater that juts into the harbor in front of Pier A. That's the one with the clock tower. This memorial honors merchant mariners, the civilian sailors whose ships have been pressed or volunteered into service in American wars since 1776. In World War II alone, an estimated 700 merchant ships were lost, with thousands of lives. The Merchant Mariners Memorial consists of 3 over-life-size figures on a slanting surface that represents the deck of a sinking ship. One of them is anxiously scanning the horizon. Another cups his hands to shout for help. The third figure lies on the deck, stretching one arm over the edge. He's trying to grasp the hand of a fourth man who's in the water. The desperately splayed fingers of the man in the water miss those of his would-be rescuer by about an inch. The artist of this work was inspired by a photo taken of crew members of the USS Muskogee. The photo was snapped by one of the Germans on the U-boat that sank the Muskogee and was published in a German newspaper with profuse praise for the captain of the U-boat. The figures in this photo all drowned. You don't need to know about the German U-boat to get the feeling that something bad is going to happen here. The premonition of doom is made visible by the fact that twice every day at high tide, the man in the water is completely submerged, except for that one splayed hand. And if you're not there at high tide, you can tell that from the stains on the rock. You can see where the water rises to. Contrast that with the Korean War Memorial. The sunshine through the head on Armistice Day device doesn't rouse our emotions. The Mariners Memorial is visually explicit and evocative, but very depressing. So, lesson number 6 for the World Trade Center Memorial. I find looking at the American Merchant Mariners Memorial like looking at a raw wound, and I usually avoid visiting it. Some submissions in the competition for the World Trade Center Memorial were even more grim than this. If the memorial at the World Trade Center were similar to this one, I'd avoid the site, and I'm sure many others would as well. So that's the lesson here. A memorial should not focus too vividly on death and destruction. Memorials don't need to merely commemorate what happened. They should commemorate how we want to remember the people who were involved. This is the 7th in my series From Portraits to Puddles, New York City Memorials from the Civil War to the World Trade Center Memorial. Let's pause after the depressing American Merchant Mariners Memorial to take a quick survey of the change in war memorials over the past 150 years. The memorials erected in Manhattan after the Civil War honored specific leaders and heroes. You can tell that just from reading their titles: Erickson, Sherman, Sheridan, Farragut, Webb. For the Spanish-American War 30 years later, we had the short-lived Dewey Arch and the grand allegorical main monument at Columbus Circle. More heroes and more satisfaction in a job well done. The memorials erected after World War I reveal a significant change. Only one is a portrait sculpture, and it represents a chaplain rather than a fighting man. The other World War I memorials show anonymous figures, several of them wounded or dead. Again, the list of titles reveals the trend: the Chelsea Park Memorial, the Abingdon Square Memorial, the Flanders Field Memorial, and so on. These memorials honor not generals and admirals, but the tens of thousands who fought and died. Within the 5 boroughs of New York City, more than 20 of these World War I memorials were erected by local communities to honor their dead. In tribute to those who died in World War II, we see for the first time a monument without human figures, the East Coast Memorial with its symbolic eagle. You might wonder why there are 6 memorials to World War I in Manhattan, but only this one to World War II. After all, 4 times as many American soldiers died in World War II. The answer is that Robert Moses, the czar of the New York City Parks Department for several decades, decided that each borough should have a single large memorial rather than many small ones. Only Brooklyn gathered enough funds for a grand monument. It stands in Cadman Plaza, near the east end of the Brooklyn Bridge. But even that memorial wasn't completed on the scale of the original design. And now back to our story of the progression of war memorials. In the memorials erected in the 1990s, we saw the anonymous Universal Soldier silhouette for the Korean War and the anonymous doomed figures on the Merchant Mariners Memorial. What's the next step beyond anonymous and depressing? To have no figures of any sort. This phase started in the early 1980s with Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial on the Mall in Washington. Usually referred to as the Wall, this memorial consists of a list of names inscribed on black granite slabs that are sunk below ground level. Lin's design was enormously controversial when it was chosen, but many Americans favored it because they had ambivalent feelings about the Vietnam War. They wanted an unobtrusive memorial, one that recognized but did not honor those who died in Vietnam. New York has two descendants of the Wall, the New York Police Memorial and the New York Vietnam Veterans Memorial. They're both within easy walking distance of Battery Park. The New York Vietnam Veterans Memorial consists of a map of Vietnam flanked by 2 rows of small slabs with lists of names. Behind these stands a wall whose glass blocks are inscribed with fragments of letters written by those who served in Vietnam to their family and friends at home. The wall is made unobtrusive, almost invisible, by being set so that the short end faces the street. So the Vietnam Memorial in New York is a map, a list of names, and a wall with excerpts from letters. The New York Police Memorial, which commemorates officers who fell in the line of duty, is even starker than that. It consists of names on a wall with a pool and a trickling stream. But the stream has significance. The problem is that if I don't tell you the significance, you'll never know it. Here's the official explanation of this memorial. Long quote. The design of the memorial was composed of 2 distinct parts using water as a metaphor. A fountain serves as the genesis of the memorial and represents the rookie police officer's first day, while a linear flume acts as the timeline of the officer's career. Water flows gently over the split-face bottom of the flume, leading to a slot in the granite wall. Finally, the water comes to rest in a shallow pool, marking the police officer's death. The death of the police officer is commemorated in an outdoor room defined by 2 parallel granite walls and depressed 30 inches below the esplanade. A wall along the western edge holds the names of the officers and dates on which they were killed. Constructed of green granite, the stone is rendered with a split-face finish facing outward and polished surface facing inward, reinforcing the sacred nature of the space. Outside the room, 3 flagpoles stand as sentinels. End of the long quote. So, the stream is an officer's career, the pool is his death in the line of duty, and the contrast between polished and rough granite indicates sacredness. This is not common symbolism. It's not something a passerby might be expected to know, the way he'd know at the East Coast Memorial that an eagle symbolizes America and a wreath symbolizes mourning. The New York Police Memorial is so abstract and abstruse that it requires that someone explain its meaning. In that sense, it's like that light shining through the head of the soldier in the Korean War Memorial. The New York Police Memorial is peaceful, and it's a soothing place to sit and rest, but it does nothing to remind us of the courage and dedication of police officers who died in the line of duty. Okay, lesson number 7 for the World Trade Center. The focal points of the Police Memorial and the New York Vietnam Veterans Memorial are lists of names. But there's a problem with this. Memorials are erected by the living to help remember those who have died. It's certainly not wrong to include lists of names. Such lists appear on the main memorial, on many local World War I memorials, and on the East Coast Memorial, to name a few. The problem arises when the lists of names plus architectural or landscape elements are the sole content of the memorial. If you visit the New York Vietnam Memorial or the New York Police Memorial with Erickson or the East Coast Memorial fresh in your mind, you'll literally feel the difference. Proper names identify specific people. If you don't know those people personally, then the most you can get from such a list of names is lots of policemen died or lots of servicemen died in Vietnam. An artist, a visual artist, can reach a much wider audience with a well-conceived and well-executed portrait of a specific human being, such as Erickson, or an allegorical or symbolic figure, such as the eagle on the East Coast Memorial. Put simply, representational figures communicate ideas and values across space and time in a way that proper names alone cannot. This is the 8th and final section of From Portraits to Puddles, New York City Memorials from the Civil War to the World Trade Center Memorial. We're going to start with a review of lessons learned about memorials. Lesson 1. A memorial doesn't have to give full details like a history book. The point of a memorial is to remind, not to teach. Lesson 2. Sculptures that are not portraits, such as an unidentified sailor or an allegorical figure, can also serve as effective memorials. Lesson 3. A memorial that doesn't show a specific individual can nevertheless remind us of the sort of people who are being remembered. Lesson 4. The addition of a recognizable figure, even if it's a bird or animal rather than a human being, makes a memorial appeal to a much wider audience than a list of names alone. Lesson 5. A memorial that requires abstruse knowledge, here the fact that the sun shines through the head on Armistice Day, will leave most viewers unmoved. Lesson 6. Memorials that are very depressing or gruesome may drive people away. And finally, Lesson 7. Lists of proper names don't have a strong impact except for those who knew the people named. If you remember nothing else from this essay, remember this. Representational sculpture has the ability to communicate ideas and values across space and time in a way that landscape architecture and proper names cannot. That's why representational art evokes much stronger emotions than a list of names or a group of trees or trickling stream. For more on how art performs this function, see my book, Getting More Enjoyment from Art You Love. Now, let's apply these lessons to the World Trade Center Memorial. Reflecting absence, the winning entry for the World Trade Center Memorial is another descendant of Maya Lin's Wall, the Vietnam War Memorial in D.C. It's landscape architecture, a list of names set among trees and reflecting pools. By itself, its voice is as weak as the East Coast Memorial would be without the eagle. The bane of blandness is unfortunately not an issue only for New York's World Trade Center Memorial. Across the country, memorials are now routinely created that have no figurative elements, only lists of names set in landscape architecture, trees, grass, benches, reflecting pools. These 9/11 memorials from Washington, D.C. and Shanksville, Pennsylvania are of this sort. This is the memorial to the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995. Its elements are given in Wikipedia as the gates of time, a reflecting pool, a field of empty chairs, a survivor's wall, and a survivor's tree. But what if Judging from the age of sculptures in Battery Park and elsewhere in Manhattan, the World Trade Center Memorial will probably be with us for at least a century. Having a memorable memorial is worth an effort. After all, how often do you have the chance to influence what your great-grandchildren will see? We can't make reflecting absence go away, but we could easily add something to the site that has a wider appeal. I'd personally like to see 2 representational monuments at the World Trade Center, honoring the 2 distinct types of people who were at the Twin Towers on 9/11. The first monument would be to the rescue workers who ran to the site while everyone else did their best to flee. The message of this monument would be recognition of the rescue workers' heroism and courage in the face of a horrific event. The Firemen's Memorial on Riverside Drive, 8 miles north of Battery Park, offers a very similar message. These men were brave, they died, we miss them, and we will not forget them. The second monument would be to those who worked at the World Trade Center. They were heroes of another sort, and the memorial to them would be a celebration of productive work. Work is, after all, why they were there, and it's far from mundane. As Ayn Rand put it, quote, "Productive work is the road of man's unlimited achievement and calls upon the highest attributes of his character, his creative ability, his ambitiousness, his self-assertiveness, his refusal to bear uncontested disasters, his dedication to the goal of reshaping the earth in the image of his values." End of quote. Creativity, ambition, and the ability to create wealth are what the terrorists were attacking on 9/11. That's why the World Trade Center was their target in New York. Creativity, ambition, and the production of wealth are what we're endorsing and celebrating by rebuilding on the World Trade Center site. A memorial to those who died there because they worked there would reflect that. In short, the memorials at the World Trade Center should commemorate how the rescue workers and the people who worked there lived rather than how they died. I have no figures in mind to represent courage or productivity, but I would love to see what a top-notch representational artist could come up with. Wouldn't you? If you want something as evocative as Erickson or the East Coast Memorial or the Firemen's Memorial at the World Trade Center, something more than pools, trees, and lists of victims, it's still possible. Frederick Hart's 3 Soldiers was added to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington several years after Lynn's wall was dedicated. Contact information for some of the relevant officials is in the first URL on this screen. Do something about this. Your great-grandchildren will thank you. And I thank you for listening. If you're interested in more of my writings, I do a Sunday recommendations email every week. You can also support me on Patreon and check out dianedurantiwriter.com for more posts on sculpture, painting, music, and my other obsessions. Thank you.